Paralyzed kitten left in trash to die, but a homeless man's choice changed everything. The autumn wind cut through the alley behind Grantley's supermarket like a cold blade, whistling between the dumpsters and carrying the mingled scents of discarded produce and stale coffee grounds. On this particular evening, as twilight settled over the small town of Mapleton, something moved among the trash bags and soggy cardboard boxes. Something small, desperate, and very much alive. A tiny sound rose above the wind's moan, a persistent mewing that seemed impossibly fragile against the harsh backdrop of the alley. The sound came from a soaked cardboard box, once used for pickles, now partially collapsed from the afternoon's rain. Inside, barely visible in the fading light, two enormous amber eyes stared out at a world that had already rejected them. The kitten was no larger than a man's hand, its grey-striped fur matted and damp. When it tried to move, only its front paws responded, scraping weakly against the soggy cardboard. The back legs remained motionless, dragging behind like abandoned things. Yet despite this cruel limitation, the kitten kept crying out, as if certain that someone somewhere would hear. Rowan Hale wasn't looking for company that evening. At 58, with a weathered face that had seen more sidewalks than sofas over the past 3 years, he had perfected the art of invisibility. His faded canvas backpack contained everything he owned: a spare shirt, a dog-eared paperback, a plastic water bottle, and a thin blanket that did little against the deepening chill of late October. His worn boots made no sound as he moved through the alley, eyes downcast as he searched for anything useful before the night settled in completely. The mewing stopped him. He paused, head tilted, wondering if he'd imagined it. Then it came again, more insistent this time. "Probably just a bird," he muttered, pulling his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders. But his feet betrayed him, moving toward the sound even as his mind counseled against it. When Rowan peered into the box, the kitten stopped crying for just a moment. Their eyes met, amber to faded blue, and something shifted in the air between them. The kitten renewed its cries, louder now, as if recognizing its one chance at salvation. "Hey there, little one," Rowan said, his voice rough from disuse. He crouched down, his knees protesting the movement. "What happened to you?" His calloused fingers hovered over the tiny creature, hesitant. The kitten strained upward, front paws reaching. Rowan noticed immediately that something was wrong with its back legs. They dragged limply as the kitten struggled to move. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. "Someone just tossed you away, didn't they?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Join the club." The battle that followed took place entirely within Rowan. He had no home, barely enough food for himself, and winter was coming fast. Taking on responsibility for another life seemed impossible, perhaps even cruel. What could he offer this fragile creature except more suffering? Yet as the kitten continued to cry, something long dormant stirred in Rowan's chest. When was the last time any living thing had needed him specifically? When had anyone looked at him with such naked hope? "This is a terrible idea," he said aloud, even as his hands moved to cup the tiny body. The kitten felt like nothing in his palms, all bones and damp fur and rapid heartbeat. When he lifted it to his chest, it immediately burrowed against him, seeking warmth. The rain had stopped earlier, but the night air carried the promise of frost. Rowan tucked the kitten inside his coat, feeling its tiny vibrations against his heart. The kitten stopped crying at last, replacing its desperate mews with a thread-thin purr that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet alley. "Just for tonight," Rowan told himself as he walked away from the dumpsters. "Just until you're warm and dry." But even as he said it, something told him his life had just changed irrevocably. As he walked toward the laundromat where he sometimes sheltered under the awning on cold nights, Rowan felt the unfamiliar weight of being needed. It terrified him, and yet with each step, the small warmth against his chest made him walk a little taller, a little more purposefully than he had in years. That night, under the flickering lights of the 24-hour laundromat, Rowan Hale, a man who had learned to expect nothing, gave up his only blanket to make a nest for a paralyzed kitten that someone else had thrown away. And as the small creature slept against him, its purr vibrating between them like a promise, Rowan fell asleep wondering what tomorrow would bring, the first time in years he'd allowed himself to think about any future at all. Morning arrived with the grinding of metal gates being raised and the aroma of fresh coffee and donuts from Dolly's bakery down the street. Rowan woke with a start, momentarily confused by the warm weight on his chest. The kitten was still there, curled into a tight ball of grey fur, its sides rising and falling with each tiny breath. "So it wasn't a dream," Rowan murmured, his voice morning rough. The kitten stirred at the sound, uncurling and blinking up at him with those enormous amber eyes. It stretched its front paws, kneading the air, but the back legs remained still. The sight squeezed something in Rowan's chest. "First things first," he said, carefully sitting up and cradling the kitten. "So you need a name, little one." The kitten mewed in response, a sound so small yet determined that it made the corners of Rowan's mouth twitch upward, the closest he'd come to a smile in months. "Something with wings," he decided, watching the kitten's front paws work so hard to compensate for what the back legs couldn't do. "Because you're trying so hard to fly even though you're grounded." Rowan thought of the sparrows he often watched in the park, how they darted and swooped, always seeming to find enough even in the leanest times. "Finch," he said finally. "You remind me of a finch, small but tough." Finch responded with another meow, this one sounding remarkably like approval. The practicalities of their situation quickly became apparent. Rowan had exactly $4.37 to his name, enough for a small coffee and maybe a day-old bagel. Now he had a hungry kitten to think about as well. "Don't suppose you like bagels?" he said to Finch, who was now trying to crawl up his chest, front paws scrabbling at his coat. With careful movements, Rowan packed up his meager belongings and tucked Finch back inside his coat. The morning air was sharp with cold. As they emerged from the shelter of the laundromat awning, a few early commuters hurried past, eyes averted from the homeless man talking to the bulge in his jacket. Their first stop was a convenience store, with an employee who sometimes let Rowan use the bathroom to wash up. Today, the young man behind the counter, Jason according to his name tag, looked curiously at the moving lump under Rowan's coat. "Morning, mister." "Hail," Jason said, using the formal address that always made Rowan feel simultaneously respected and ancient. "Everything okay there?" Rowan hesitated, then carefully withdrew Finch. "Found him in the trash last night," he explained, his voice low. "Back legs don't work." Jason leaned over the counter, his face softening as he looked at the tiny kitten. "Poor little guy," he said. Then, after a glance toward the back of the store to ensure his manager wasn't around, he added, "Wait here." He disappeared into the storeroom and returned moments later with a small carton of milk and a plastic bowl. "It's close to expiration anyway," he said with a conspiratorial wink, "and my cat at home wouldn't touch the wet food I bought last week. Want it?" The kindness was so unexpected that Rowan could only nod, his throat suddenly tight. "Thank you," he managed after a moment. "Bathroom's open if you need it," Jason added. "Take your time." In the small bathroom, Rowan set Finch down on his folded coat while he dampened a paper towel. Gently, he cleaned the kitten's fur, discovering that beneath the grime, Finch was a handsome tabby with distinct markings around his eyes that resembled spectacles. The back legs remained limp, but Finch seemed otherwise alert and responsive, especially when Rowan opened the small can of cat food. The kitten ate ravenously, purring between bites. Rowan dribbled a little milk into the bowl after, watching in fascination as the tiny pink tongue lapped it up. "You were starving, weren't you?" Rowan whispered, feeling a surge of anger toward whoever had abandoned this vulnerable creature. "Well, you're not alone anymore." Their day unfolded in a series of small discoveries. Finch couldn't use a litter box conventionally, but seemed instinctively clean, dragging himself away from their resting spot when nature called. Rowan fashioned a makeshift carrier from his backpack, creating a small opening so Finch could poke his head out and observe the world as they moved through town. By afternoon, they had established a routine of sorts. Rowan walked to the park, where he knew the pigeons were often fed by elderly residents. He sat on his usual bench, Finch peering curiously from the backpack, and watched as children in bright jackets played on the nearby swings. One little girl, no more than 5 or 6, noticed them. She approached cautiously, her mother hovering a few steps behind. "What's in your bag?" she asked, her voice high and clear in the crisp air. Rowan, unused to being addressed directly by anyone, much less a child, cleared his throat. "A kitten," he answered. "His name is Finch." The little girl's eyes widened. "Can I see?" After a questioning glance at the mother, who nodded tentatively, Rowan carefully lifted Finch from the backpack. The kitten blinked in the bright daylight, his amber eyes taking in the new face before him. "He's got glasses!" the little girl exclaimed. pointing to the markings around Finch's eyes. "I suppose he does," Rowan agreed, seeing it properly for the first time. "Can I pet him? I'm gentle, I promise." "Sophie's actually afraid of most cats," the mother explained, looking surprised at her daughter's interest. "He's very small," Rowan said, "and very gentle." Sophie extended one tiny finger, barely touching the top of Finch's head. The kitten responded by pushing upward into her hand, causing the little girl to giggle in delight. "He likes me," she exclaimed. "He knows a friend when he sees one," Rowan replied, the words coming from some long-forgotten part of himself. Sophie's mother studied Rowan for a long moment, her initial wariness softening slightly. "Is he hungry?" she asked, nodding toward Finch. "We have some tuna sandwiches we're not going to eat." The simple offer, made without pity or judgment, brought a lump to Rowan's throat. "He'd like that," he managed. "Thank you." As Sophie carefully fed tiny bits of tuna to Finch, other children drifted over, curious about the small creature with the bright eyes and motionless back legs. Rowan found himself explaining over and over how he'd found Finch, and how the kitten couldn't walk properly but was learning to adapt. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Finch had been petted by a dozen small hands, and Rowan had spoken more words than he had in months. Several parents had left bottles of water, and one had returned with a small bag of cat food purchased from the nearby convenience store. As they prepared to leave the park, Sophie and her mother approached one last time. "Where do you and Finch sleep?" Sophie asked innocently. Before Rowan could formulate a vague response, her mother spoke. "There's a storm coming tonight," she said quietly. "The community shelter on Elm Street is open." Rowan nodded his thanks, though he already knew he wouldn't go there. The shelter had strict rules. No pets allowed. He'd choose the cold with Finch over warmth without him. That evening, as the first raindrops began to fall, Rowan found an alcove behind the hardware store. He created a nest for Finch from his blanket, keeping only his coat for himself. The night grew colder, the rain heavier. Rowan shivered, drawing his knees to his chest for warmth. Finch crawled from his blanket nest and dragged himself across the concrete until he reached Rowan's side. With determined movements, the kitten pulled himself onto Rowan's lap and curled into a tight ball, his purr rising above the sound of rainfall. "You should stay where it's warm," Rowan chided gently, even as he cupped his hands around the small body. Finch merely purred louder, his eyes closing contentedly. In that moment, huddled against the cold with a paralyzed kitten asleep on his lap, Rowan realized something that both frightened and comforted him. He was no longer alone. For better or worse, he had made a choice. To care, to protect, to stay. It was the first promise he'd made to anyone, including himself, in years. As rain drummed against the awning above them, Rowan whispered into the darkness, "We'll figure this out together, Finch." Somehow, the kitten's purr was his only answer, but somehow it seemed enough. Sunday mornings in Mapleton had a rhythm all their own. Church bells rang across town, calling the faithful to worship. Shopkeepers moved at a more leisurely pace, and the usual weekday rush gave way to a gentler flow of people enjoying their day of rest. For Rowan and Finch, however, Sunday meant one thing: the community soup kitchen at St. Mark's Episcopal Church on the corner of Maple and 3rd. It was the one meal of the week Rowan could count on, a hot lunch served with no questions asked, no sermons required. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving behind a crystalline autumn day with a sky so blue it hurt to look at it. Rowan's joints ached from the cold night, but he moved with purpose, Finch secure in the makeshift carrier fashioned from his backpack. "We'll get you something good today," he promised the kitten, who poked his head out to watch the world go by. In just 3 days, Finch had grown more alert, his eyes tracking movement with keen interest. His appetite had improved too, though Rowan worried about providing proper nutrition with their limited resources. St. Mark's was a modest brick building with a wooden sign announcing "All are welcome" in faded paint. As Rowan approached, he slowed his pace, suddenly conscious of the small creature he carried. He'd been coming to the soup kitchen for months, but never with a companion. Would they turn him away? He hesitated at the bottom of the steps, one foot on the first riser, one still on the sidewalk. "Are you coming in or just admiring the architecture?" a warm voice asked. Rowan looked up to find a woman in her early 60s standing at the top of the steps. She wore jeans and a blue sweater, with the sleeves pushed up, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. A volunteer badge hung from a lanyard around her neck. "Maribel Drayton, kitchen coordinator." Rowan began, then stopped, unsure how to explain. Maribel descended the steps, her eyes curious but kind. "You're Rowan, right? You usually sit by the window." Surprised to be remembered, Rowan nodded. "And who's your friend?" she asked, nodding toward the backpack, where Finch had chosen that moment to meow loudly. Rowan carefully unzipped the pack a little further, revealing the kitten's face. "His name is Finch," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "I found him a few days ago. Someone left him in the trash." Maribel's face softened as she leaned closer to look at Finch. "Hello there, little one," she said gently. Then, noticing the immobile back legs as Finch shifted position, she added, "Oh, he's injured?" "His back legs don't work," Rowan explained, "but he gets around pretty well with the front ones." "May I?" Maribel asked, extending her hands. After a moment's hesitation, Rowan nodded, carefully lifting Finch from the backpack and placing him in Maribel's waiting palms. The kitten looked up at her, his amber eyes wide, then gave a small inquiring meow. "You're a handsome fellow," Maribel told him, gently examining his body with practiced hands. "And quite the fighter, I'd guess." "I know pets aren't allowed inside," Rowan said quickly. "We can wait out here until—" "Nonsense," Maribel interrupted. "The no pets rule is for health reasons, but I think we can make an exception as long as you keep him with you." She handed Finch back to Rowan with a conspiratorial smile. "Besides, I run the kitchen, and I say he's welcome." Relief washed over Rowan. "Thank you," he said simply. Inside, the church hall was warm and filled with the mingled aromas of vegetable soup, fresh bread, and coffee. About 20 people were already seated at the long tables, a mix of the homeless, the elderly, and families struggling to make ends meet. A few glanced up as Rowan entered with Maribel, but most were focused on their meals. Maribel led Rowan to a corner table slightly apart from the others. "Wait here," she instructed. "I'll bring you both something." Rowan sat, keeping Finch on his lap beneath the table. The kitten was alert, his nose twitching at the new smells. Rowan stroked his fur absently, still marveling at how quickly the tiny creature had become central to his existence. Maribel returned with a tray holding a bowl of soup, 2 slices of bread, a cup of coffee, and, to Rowan's surprise, a small saucer containing finely shredded chicken. "The chicken's for Finch," she explained, setting the tray down. "My mother's cat was on a special diet, and I learned to prepare meals for him when he was sick." "You didn't have to," Rowan began. "I wanted to," Maribel said simply. She pulled up a chair and sat across from him. "May I join you while you eat? My volunteers have everything under control for the moment." Caught off guard by the request, Rowan could only nod. He set the saucer on the floor beneath the table and carefully placed Finch beside it. The kitten sniffed the offering, then began to eat with enthusiasm, his purr audible even over the buzz of conversation in the hall. Rowan lifted his spoon, suddenly conscious of his unwashed hands and the lingering scent of the streets that clung to his clothes. He hadn't sat across a table from someone, hadn't engaged in normal mealtime conversation, in longer than he cared to remember. "He's got quite an appetite," Maribel observed, watching Finch. "That's a good sign." Rowan nodded, taking a spoonful of soup to avoid speaking. It was rich and flavorful, warming him from the inside out. "How long have you had him?" Maribel asked. 3 days, Rowan replied after swallowing. "Found him behind Grantley's. And his legs. Has a vet looked at him?" Rowan shook his head, feeling a flush of shame. "I can't afford—" he started, then stopped. "No." Maribel's expression remained free of judgment. "There's a low-cost clinic on Westbrook Avenue," she said. "They do pro bono work sometimes, especially for special cases." She glanced down at Finch, who had finished his chicken and was now attempting to clean his face with a paw. "I volunteer there on Tuesdays. I could take you both if you'd like." The offer hung in the air between them. Rowan stared into his soup, conflicting emotions battling within him. Pride told him to refuse, to handle this on his own as he'd handled everything else since losing his job, his home, his place in the world. But concern for Finch pushed against that pride, insisting that the kitten deserved proper care, regardless of Rowan's discomfort with charity. "Why would you help us?" he asked finally, his voice low. Maribel considered this, her head tilted slightly. "Because everyone deserves kindness," she said after a moment. "And because that little cat chose you for a reason." Before Rowan could respond, a commotion near the serving table drew Maribel's attention. "Think about it," she said, rising from her chair. "We leave for the clinic at 9 on Tuesday. I'll be here." With that, she hurried away to resolve whatever crisis had arisen in the kitchen. Rowan finished his meal in silence, occasionally reaching down to stroke Finch, who had curled up against his foot. The kitten's body was warm, his purr a steady vibration against Rowan's ankle. As he prepared to leave, gathering Finch and securing him in the backpack, Rowan noticed Maribel watching from across the room. She raised a hand in farewell, her expression warm. Rowan nodded in return, a gesture that contained neither acceptance nor rejection of her offer, merely acknowledgement. Outside, the autumn sunlight bathed the street in gold. Rowan stood on the church steps, feeling the weight of the decision before him. To accept help was to admit need, to become visible again after years of deliberate invisibility. Yet, as Finch shifted in the backpack, his small head poking out to survey their surroundings, Rowan knew what his choice would be. Tuesday would find them at St. Mark's at 9 o'clock, waiting for Maribel Drayton and her offered kindness. Not for his sake, Rowan told himself firmly, but for Finch, the unexpected ally who had somehow turned his careful solitude into something else entirely. As they walked toward the park, where Rowan knew Sophie and other children might be playing, he found himself planning for Tuesday, anticipating it rather than dreading it. It was a strange feeling, this looking forward, this thinking beyond the immediate needs of the day. Stranger still was the realization that, for the first time in years, Rowan Hale was allowing himself to hope. Tuesday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that hinted at winter's approach. Rowan woke early, earlier than usual, a knot of anxiety tight in his stomach. Today was clinic day. He'd spent Monday preparing as best he could. At the public library, he'd used the free computers to research feline paralysis, reading until his eyes burned from the screen's glare. At the park restroom, he'd washed his face and hands thoroughly, even using some of the liquid soap to shampoo his beard. His clothes remained worn and wrinkled, but he'd done what he could to appear presentable. Finch seemed to sense something was different. The kitten was unusually quiet that morning, watching Rowan with those intelligent amber eyes as he packed their few belongings. "It's going to be all right," Rowan told him, not entirely sure if he was reassuring Finch or himself. "We're going to find out what's wrong with your legs. Maybe they can fix you up." Though Rowan had tried not to nurture false hope, he couldn't help but imagine walking away from the clinic with a fully mobile Finch. Perhaps it was something simple, a pinched nerve, a temporary condition that medicine could resolve. Perhaps this was the beginning of their luck changing. At precisely 10 minutes to 9, Rowan arrived at St. Mark's, Finch secure in the backpack. The church was quiet, the soup kitchen not yet open for its weekday lunch service. For a moment, Rowan wondered if he'd misunderstood, if Maribel had merely been making polite conversation rather than a genuine offer. But then the side door opened and Maribel emerged, car keys jingling in her hand. She wore a green cardigan over jeans, her silver-streaked hair in its usual practical ponytail. Her face brightened when she saw them waiting. "Good morning," she called, walking over. "I'm glad you came." Rowan nodded, suddenly unable to find words. The simple act of accepting help, of appearing at an appointed time, of becoming part of someone else's schedule, felt foreign, almost dangerous. Maribel seemed to understand his discomfort. "The clinic's about 15 minutes away," she said, leading him toward a modest blue sedan parked on the street. "Dr. Chen is expecting us." The drive passed in relative silence. Rowan sat stiffly in the passenger seat, the backpack on his lap, one hand inside to reassure Finch. Maribel didn't press him for conversation, instead pointing out landmarks as they drove through parts of town Rowan rarely visited. "That's the old textile mill," she said, gesturing toward a brick building with tall windows. "They're turning it into apartments now. And over there is Westbrook Community College, where I teach part-time, cooking classes for the continuing education program." Rowan found himself oddly comforted by her steady stream of information, requiring nothing from him except to listen. The Westbrook Animal Clinic was a small single-story building with a painted mural of dogs and cats across its front window. Inside, the waiting room smelled of disinfectant and pet shampoo, with chairs arranged around the perimeter and educational posters on the walls. A young woman at the reception desk greeted Maribel warmly. "Good morning, Ms. Drayton. Dr. Chen said to send you right back when you arrived." "Thank you, Jenny," Maribel replied. She turned to Rowan. "Ready?" He nodded, clutching the backpack a little tighter. The examination room was brightly lit, with a metal table in the center and cabinets lining the walls. A woman in her 40s, with short black hair and glasses, looked up from a chart as they entered. "Maribel, good to see you," she said with a warm smile. Her eyes moved to Rowan, curious but not judgmental. "And you must be Mr. Hale. I'm Dr. Chen. Just Rowan." He managed his voice rough. "And this is our patient?" Dr. Chen asked, nodding toward the backpack. With careful movements, Rowan unzipped the pack and gently lifted Finch onto the examination table. The kitten blinked in the bright light, looking small and vulnerable against the metal surface. "Well, hello there," Dr. Chen said softly, extending her hand for Finch to sniff. "Aren't you a handsome fellow?" To Rowan's relief, Finch seemed unafraid, stretching his neck to investigate the doctor's fingers before giving them a gentle headbutt of approval. "He's friendly," Dr. Chen observed. "That's good. Now let's see what's going on with those back legs." The examination was thorough but gentle. Dr. Chen checked Finch's eyes, ears and mouth, then carefully palpated his spine and limbs, explaining each step as she went. Finch remained surprisingly cooperative, only meowing in protest when she tested the reflexes in his back legs. "He's about 8 weeks old, I'd estimate," she said. "Underweight, but not dangerously so. His front legs and upper body are developing good muscle tone, which is excellent. Now I'd like to do some neurological tests." Rowan watched anxiously as Dr. Chen performed a series of assessments, gently manipulating Finch's legs and testing his responses to various stimuli. The kitten endured it all with remarkable patience, occasionally looking to Rowan as if for reassurance. "I'd like to take some X-rays," Dr. Chen said finally. "It won't hurt him, but we'll need to keep him still. Maribel, could you assist?" Maribel nodded, moving to help while Rowan was directed to wait in a chair in the corner. He watched as they carefully positioned Finch on a small platform, Maribel gently restraining him while Dr. Chen operated the X-ray machine. The wait for the results felt interminable. Rowan sat with his hands clasped between his knees, staring at the linoleum floor. What if the news was bad? What if Finch needed expensive treatment or surgery? What if, worst of all, there was nothing to be done, and the kindest option would be to— "Rowan?" Maribel's voice broke into his spiraling thoughts. "Dr. Chen has the results." He looked up to find both women watching him, their expressions unreadable. Finch was back on the examination table, sitting up on his front legs, head tilted as if he too awaited the verdict. Dr. Chen gestured for Rowan to join them. "I've reviewed the X-rays," she said, her tone professional but kind. "Finch has what we call a congenital neurological condition. He was born with incomplete development of certain neural pathways that control his hind legs." "Can it be fixed?" Rowan asked, the words coming out more abruptly than he intended. Dr. Chen's expression softened. "It's not something that can be cured or corrected with surgery," she explained gently. "The good news is that it's not progressive, it won't get worse, and it doesn't cause him pain." Rowan absorbed this information slowly, his eyes on Finch, who was now attempting to groom his face with a paw. "So he'll never walk normally?" "No," Dr. Chen confirmed, "but cats are remarkably adaptable. With his strong front legs and your care, he can have a full, active life." The diagnosis settled over Rowan like a weight. Not crushing, but substantial. He'd hoped, despite his efforts not to, for a different outcome. Yet as he watched Finch, alert and engaged with his surroundings despite his limitation, a different feeling emerged alongside the disappointment. Resolve. "What can I do to help him?" he asked. Dr. Chen smiled as if this was exactly the question she'd been waiting for. "There are several things. First, he needs good nutrition to build strength in his front legs and core. Second, regular exercise to maintain that strength, supervised playtime where he can pull himself around safely. Third, you'll need to help him with certain activities, like using a litter box." She turned to a cabinet and began gathering supplies: a small bag of specialized kitten food, a bottle of vitamins, a collapsible litter box. "The most important thing," she continued, "is that you treat him normally. Don't pity him. Cats don't waste energy feeling sorry for themselves. They adapt and move forward. Follow his lead." Rowan nodded, a lump forming in his throat as he watched Dr. Chen assemble what amounted to a care package for Finch. "There's one more option you might consider," Maribel said, speaking for the first time since the diagnosis. "Some paralyzed cats use what's basically a tiny wheelchair, a frame with wheels that supports their back legs. They can be quite effective," Dr. Chen agreed, "though they're usually custom-made and can be expensive." Expensive. The word hung in the air, reminding Rowan of the vast gulf between what Finch needed and what he could provide. As if reading his thoughts, Maribel added, "There's a handyman at St. Mark's, Earl Whittaker. He's retired from the hardware store and loves tinkering with projects. I bet he could fashion something simple to start with. And in the meantime," Dr. Chen said, handing Rowan the bag of supplies, Finch will continue to adapt on his own. He's already figured out how to compensate remarkably well. Rowan accepted the bag, feeling both overwhelmed and grateful. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the kindness he'd been shown. "What do I owe you?" Dr. Chen waved a hand dismissively. "Maribel volunteers here every week, helping with our community outreach program. Consider this part of that program." Before Rowan could protest, she continued, "I would like to see Finch again in a few weeks, though, to check his progress and make any adjustments to his care plan." It was a gentle command, not a request. Rowan nodded, recognizing that he was being entrusted with Finch's well-being, a responsibility he could not take lightly. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Chen gently scratched Finch behind the ears. "You've got a good advocate here," she told the kitten, nodding toward Rowan. "Most people wouldn't have stopped to look in that box." The simple observation, free of judgment or excessive praise, affected Rowan more deeply than any flowery thanks could have. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He'd simply not looked away when it would have been easier to do so. In the car, heading back towards St. Mark's, Maribel broke the silence. "Are you disappointed?" "About the diagnosis?" Rowan considered the question, watching as Finch poked his head out of the backpack to observe the passing scenery. "Yes," he admitted finally. "I hoped there was a fix. Something simple." Maribel nodded, her eyes on the road. "Life's rarely simple," she said. "But sometimes the complicated paths lead to better places than we'd have found otherwise." Rowan didn't respond, but as Finch settled back into the backpack with a contented purr, he found himself wondering if Maribel might be right. The path ahead was unclear, fraught with challenges he wasn't sure he could overcome. But for the first time in years, the week following Finch's diagnosis brought changes both subtle and profound to Rowan's daily routine. The supplies from Dr. Chen demanded a level of organization he hadn't needed in years. Each morning began with careful measurement of Finch's special food, mixed with the vitamin supplement. Midday brought exercise sessions where Rowan created small obstacle courses from found objects. A discarded magazine became a ramp. A cardboard box transformed into a tunnel. The most dramatic change, however, was in how others began to see them. Word spread through the park about the homeless man and his special kitten. Children who had previously been steered away from Rowan now approached eagerly, parents in tow, asking to see Finch and hear his story. Sophie, the little girl who had first befriended them, became a regular visitor, often bringing small offerings, a toy mouse made from yarn, a discarded baby sock she'd stuffed with catnip. "My mum says Finch is teaching me responsibility," she told Rowan one crisp afternoon, watching as the kitten batted at the toy mouse with determined front paws. "And bravery, too." "Bravery?" Rowan asked, curious. Sophie nodded solemnly. "Because he doesn't give up even though his legs don't work right, and neither do you." The simple observation, delivered with a child's forthright innocence, left Rowan momentarily speechless. He had never considered his own circumstances in terms of bravery. Mere survival, yes, but not courage. The idea that Sophie, and perhaps others, might see something admirable in his situation was both uncomfortable and strangely warming. On Saturday morning, a week and a half after finding Finch, Rowan made his way to St. Mark's as promised. Maribel had arranged for him to meet Earl Whitaker, the retired hardware store owner who might be able to help with a mobility device for Finch. The church's small workshop was located in the basement, accessible through a side door that Rowan had never noticed before. He hesitated before knocking, suddenly conscious of his worn clothes and unwashed hair. What right did he have to ask for more help, to take up more of people's time and resources? Finch, as if sensing his reluctance, gave a loud meow from inside the backpack. All right, Rowan muttered. "We've come this far." The door swung open before he could knock, revealing a tall, thin man in his 70s with a shock of white hair and work-stained hands. He wore denim overalls over a flannel shirt, and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "You must be Rowan," the man said, extending a hand. "Earl Whitaker. Maribel told me all about you and your special friend. Come on in before all the heat escapes." The workshop was warm and smelled of sawdust and machine oil. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools and projects in various stages of completion. A wood stove crackled in the corner, casting a golden glow over the room. "So, where's this famous kitten I've been hearing about?" Earl asked, clearing a space on the central workbench. Rowan carefully removed Finch from the backpack and set him on the workbench. The kitten immediately began to explore, front paws working quickly as he investigated the new environment. Earl watched with obvious delight. "Well, look at him go. Got a real determination about him, doesn't he? He does, Rowan agreed, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. Maribel explained what you're looking for, Earl said, gently running a finger along Finch's spine. A way to give those back legs some wheels. I've been doing some research and sketching out ideas. He pulled a notebook from his overall pocket and opened it to reveal detailed drawings of small carts and harnesses. The trick is making something light enough that it won't tire him out, but sturdy enough to handle his movements, and it needs to be adjustable as he grows. Rowan stared at the sketches, taken aback by the time, and thought Earl had already invested. So you did all this before even meeting us? Earl shrugged, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. I like a challenge, and Maribel said it was important. For the next hour, Earl took measurements of Finch, who tolerated the process with surprising patience. The elderly craftsman explained each step, showing Rowan how the cart would attach with soft straps around Finch's middle, supporting his hind legs while allowing his front legs full mobility. I'm thinking aluminum for the frame, lightweight but strong, and these small wheels from a toy car set I've got should work perfectly. We'll start simple, see how he takes to it, then make adjustments as needed. As Earl worked, sketching and measuring, Rowan found himself drawn into the process, offering suggestions based on his observations of how Finch moved and balanced. It had been a long time since anyone had asked for his input, valued his observations. How much will all this cost? Rowan asked finally, the question that had been weighing on him since they arrived. Earl looked up from his work, his expression thoughtful. Tell you what, he said after a moment. The materials I've got on hand already. Been collecting odds and ends for years, drives my wife crazy. As for labor, he paused, studying Rowan with keen blue eyes. The church roof leaks in 3 places, and these old knees of mine don't do ladders anymore. You any good with basic repairs? Rowan blinked, surprised by the offer. I worked construction for 15 years, he said. Roofing, framing, finishing. I can handle it. Then we've got ourselves a deal, Earl said, extending his hand again. You fix the roof. I'll build this little fellow his wheels. Fair trade. No charity involved. The distinction was important. Rowan recognized it immediately. Earl was offering him the chance to earn Finch's cart, to contribute rather than simply receive. The knot of discomfort that had been sitting in his chest since entering the workshop began to loosen. Deal, Rowan agreed, shaking Earl's hand. Good. Now, I've got most of what I need, but it'll take me a few days to put it all together. Can you come back Wednesday afternoon? Say around 2. Rowan nodded, careful not to show how the simple question, making plans days in advance, being expected somewhere, affected him. Such normal, everyday things had become foreign during his years on the street, where each day was about immediate survival rather than future planning. As they prepared to leave, Earl handed Rowan a small paper bag. Almost forgot. The wife sent these when she heard about your kitten. Said every growing boy needs proper nutrition. Inside the bag, Rowan found several cans of premium cat food and a small package of freeze-dried chicken treats. The unexpected kindness brought a familiar tightness to his throat. Thank her for me, he managed. Earl nodded, his expression suggesting he understood more than Rowan had said. See you Wednesday, and don't worry, we'll have this little guy zooming around in no time. Outside, the October air was crisp and bright. Rowan stood for a moment on the church steps. Finch settled back in the backpack, the bag of cat food a welcome weight in his hand. The interaction with Earl had left him feeling strangely energized, as if some long-dormant part of himself was stirring back to life. For the rest of the weekend, Rowan found himself looking forward to Wednesday with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. What if Finch didn't take to the cart? What if the whole idea failed? Worse, what if it succeeded, creating expectations Rowan couldn't fulfill long-term? These worries circled in his mind as he carried out his daily routines, finding safe places to sleep, scrounging for food, caring for Finch. Yet alongside the worry ran a thin, bright thread of hope that refused to be extinguished. When Wednesday finally arrived, Rowan and Finch were at the workshop door precisely at 2 o'clock. Earl welcomed them with obvious excitement, ushering them inside where Maribel was already waiting, a camera in her hands. Hope you don't mind, she said, holding up the camera. I thought we should document this momentous occasion. In the center of the workbench sat what looked like a miniature chariot, a small aluminum frame with 2 wheels, padded with soft fabric where it would contact Finch's body. Straps of adjustable Velcro hung from the sides, designed to secure around the kitten's midsection. It's just the first prototype, Earl explained, suddenly sounding nervous. We'll make adjustments once we see how he does with it. Rowan carefully placed Finch on the workbench. The kitten immediately began to explore the strange contraption, sniffing it cautiously. "Let's see if he'll accept it," Earl said, gently lifting Finch and positioning him in the harness. The first attempt was awkward. Finch froze when the straps tightened around him, his body tense with uncertainty. The wheels didn't touch the ground as Earl held him, and the kitten twisted his head around, trying to see what was happening behind him. "Easy does it," Earl murmured, slowly lowering Finch until the wheels made contact with the workbench surface. "There you go, little fellow." For a moment, Finch remained motionless, adjusting to the sensation of the harness and the wheels touching the surface beneath him. Then, cautiously, he moved one front paw forward. The cart rolled with him. Finch froze again, clearly startled by the movement. Then, with evident determination, he moved both front paws, pulling himself and the cart forward several inches. "He's doing it!" Maribel exclaimed, the camera clicking rapidly. Finch seemed to gain confidence with each small movement. Soon he was exploring the entire workbench, the wheels making a soft metallic sound against the wood surface. When he reached the edge, Rowan gently redirected him, marveling at how quickly the kitten was adapting to his new mobility. "We should try him on the floor," Earl suggested after several minutes. "That's where he'll really get the benefit." Rowan carefully lifted Finch and set him on the concrete floor of the workshop. After a moment's hesitation, the kitten began to move, pulling himself forward with his strong front legs, while the wheels supported his hindquarters. The sound of the little wheels rolling across the floor filled the workshop, a tiny metallic music that seemed to announce a new beginning. Finch moved hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, exploring the perimeter of the room. Rowan watched, a strange tightness in his chest. The sight of Finch moving freely, no longer dragging his back legs but rolling smoothly on his custom-made wheels, was more affecting than he'd anticipated. This small act of engineering had transformed the kitten's experience of the world, expanding his horizons in ways that seemed almost miraculous. "I think we can call this a success," Earl said, his voice gruff with emotion. "He's taken to it like a duck to water." "Rowan, look," Maribel said softly, pointing to where Finch had discovered a patch of sunlight on the floor and was spinning in a small circle, apparently delighted with his new ability to turn quickly. The simple joy in the kitten's movements broke something open inside Rowan. He turned away abruptly, not wanting the others to see the sudden moisture in his eyes. Earl, sensing Rowan's emotion, cleared his throat. "Well, I'd better explain the maintenance," he said briskly. "The straps might need adjusting as he grows, and the wheels should be oiled occasionally to keep them spinning freely." Grateful for the practical distraction, Rowan listened as Earl detailed the care of the cart, asking questions and committing the instructions to memory. Meanwhile, Finch continued his exploration, occasionally stopping to look back at Rowan as if to say, "Are you seeing this? Look what I can do." Before they left, Earl presented Rowan with a small toolkit containing oil, spare straps, and the tools needed for basic adjustments to the cart. "I'll expect you Monday morning to look at that roof," he reminded Rowan. 8 o'clock sharp. Bring your appetite. The wife insists on feeding anyone who works on church property." The invitation, or rather, the expectation of Rowan's return, of his contribution, settled around him like a warm coat. "I'll be here," he promised. Outside, with Finch secured back in the backpack for the journey home, they'd decided it was safer to use the cart only in controlled environments for now. Maribel walked with them to the street. "Where will you go now?" she asked, her tone careful, non-judgmental. Rowan hesitated. In truth, he hadn't thought beyond this moment, beyond the triumph of seeing Finch in his new wheels. The practicalities of their situation, the approaching winter, their continued homelessness, reasserted themselves in his consciousness. "The park, probably," he said finally. "There's a dry spot under the bandstand if it rains." Maribel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "The community center on Oak Street has a program for homeless veterans," she said casually. "They might have resources, even if it's just a warm place to stay during the cold months ahead." Rowan stiffened slightly. "I'm not a veteran." "No, but they sometimes have openings for others, especially during winter," Maribel continued, seemingly unperturbed by his reaction. "And they allow pets if they're well behaved, and the owner takes responsibility. Just something to consider." Before Rowan could respond, she handed him a small card. "My number," she explained, "in case you need anything for Finch, or yourself." The card was simple, just her name and a phone number, no title or organization listed. Rowan tucked it into his pocket, unsure what to say. "Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. Thank you, he managed finally, for everything. Maribel smiled, reaching out to stroke Finch's head where it poked out of the backpack. He's special, she said. And he chose well when he chose you. As Rowan walked away, Finch's comfortable weight against his back, he found himself turning Maribel's words over in his mind. Had Finch chosen him, or had it been mere chance? A homeless man happening upon an abandoned kitten, two discarded lives intersecting in a dark alley? Yet as he felt Finch shift position, settling more comfortably against him with a soft purr, Rowan wondered if perhaps there was more to it than chance. Perhaps they had found each other precisely because each needed what the other could provide. Finch needed someone who wouldn't give up on him despite his limitations. Rowan needed someone who saw value in him when he'd forgotten his own worth. The thought accompanied him as they made their way to the park, where children would soon gather, eager to see Finch demonstrate his new wheels. For the first time in years, Rowan found himself not dreading the attention, but looking forward to it, to sharing this small triumph, to being part of something that brought joy rather than pity or discomfort. It was a strange feeling, this cautious optimism. Strange, but not unwelcome. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing bitter winds and early snowflakes that dissolved on contact with the still warm earth. Rowan woke each morning with stiff joints and numb fingers, grateful for the thick sleeping bag that Earl had found in the church's storage room and insisted he take after completing the roof repairs. The sleeping bag, like so many recent gifts, had been presented not as charity but as fair exchange, payment for Rowan's labor. Earl had a knack for creating such arrangements, a talent for offering help in ways that preserved rather than diminished dignity. The roof repairs had led to other odd jobs around the church, fixing loose floorboards, replacing rotted window frames, patching drywall in the Sunday school rooms. Each task completed meant another meal, another small provision for Finch, another day of purpose. Finch, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity. His wheeled cart, which Earl had painted bright blue at Sophie's insistence, attracted attention wherever they went. Children called out his name in the park. Shopkeepers who had once viewed Rowan with suspicion now greeted them both, sometimes offering scraps for the kitten or a cup of coffee for the man. Even the community center on Oak Street, which Rowan had finally visited at Maribel's continued urging, had bent its rules to allow Finch to accompany Rowan during his intake interview. The prospect of a warm place to sleep during the worst winter nights was becoming a real possibility, though the idea of returning to any form of institutional living left Rowan uneasy. It was, in many ways, the best their life had been since that fateful night behind the supermarket. Yet as the temperature dropped and the days shortened, a different kind of chill settled over Rowan, an internal winter that no sleeping bag could warm. It began with small things: difficulty sleeping, despite his physical exhaustion, a tightness in his chest when faced with kindness, moments of inexplicable anger, followed by crushing guilt. The old urge to disappear, to become invisible again, grew stronger with each passing day. Dr. Chen noticed it first during Finch's follow-up appointment in early November. "The kitten is thriving," she observed, watching Finch maneuver confidently in his cart around the examination room. "He's gained almost a pound. His coat is healthier and he's clearly adapted well to his wheels. You've done an excellent job with him, Rowan." Rowan nodded, acknowledging the praise without meeting her eyes. He should have felt proud, satisfied with Finch's progress. Instead, he felt hollow, as if the compliment had passed through him without finding purchase. "And how are you doing?" Dr. Chen asked, her tone casual but her gaze sharp. "Fine," Rowan replied automatically. "No complaints." Dr. Chen studied him for a moment longer, then returned her attention to Finch. "Sometimes," she said conversationally, "when people take on the care of a special needs animal, they focus so intently on the animal's well-being that they neglect their own. It's a form of displacement, channeling all concern outward to avoid looking inward." Rowan remained silent, uncomfortable with her perception. "Just something to consider, Doctor," Chen continued, writing notes in Finch's chart. "After all, Finch needs you healthy and stable." The observation stayed with Rowan, nagging at him like a splinter under the skin. Was that what he was doing, using Finch as a distraction from his own circumstances? And if so, what was wrong with that? Better to focus on the kitten's needs than to dwell on his own seemingly insurmountable problems. Yet the question persisted, gaining strength as November deepened. One particularly cold morning, as Rowan sat on his usual park bench watching Finch explore in his cart, a well-dressed man stopped to observe them. "That's quite a setup," the man commented, nodding toward Finch. "Did you build it yourself?" "A friend did," Rowan replied, keeping his answers brief as he always did with strangers. The man watched Finch for another moment, then asked abruptly, "Don't you think that cat deserves better than this? A proper home? Veterinary care?" The question struck Rowan like a physical blow. It wasn't the first time someone had implied he wasn't providing adequately for Finch, but something about the man's tone, the casual cruelty of his assumption, cut deeper than usual. "He sees a vet regularly," Rowan said, his voice tight, "and he's well fed. But living on the streets?" the man persisted. "With winter coming? Surely there are shelters that could take him, find him a permanent home with someone who can actually provide for him." Before Rowan could respond, Sophie appeared, running toward them with her mother following at a more sedate pace. "Mr. Rowan, Finch," she called, her face bright with excitement. "Look what we brought." She held up a small quilted jacket, clearly handmade, sized perfectly for a kitten. "Grandma helped me make it," she explained breathlessly. "For when it gets really cold. It has Velcro so it can go around the cart straps." The well-dressed man looked from Sophie to Rowan, then back again, his expression unreadable. Without another word, he walked away, leaving Rowan shaken by the encounter. "Is something wrong?" Sophie's mother asked, noticing Rowan's distress. "No," he lied, forcing a smile for Sophie's sake. "This is perfect timing. Finch was just saying he needed a winter coat." Sophie's delight as she helped fit the tiny jacket on Finch temporarily pushed aside Rowan's dark thoughts. The kitten seemed equally pleased, preening as Sophie adjusted the small garment around his front legs and over his back. But that night, huddled in his sleeping bag beneath the park bandstand, Rowan couldn't escape the man's words. They replayed in his mind, merging with his own doubts and fears. What if the man was right? What if Rowan's attachment to Finch was selfish, depriving the kitten of a better life? He watched Finch sleeping peacefully in his nest of blankets, the small chest rising and falling with each breath. In the pale moonlight filtering through the bandstand rails, the kitten looked impossibly vulnerable and impossibly trusting. "Maybe he's right," Rowan whispered to the darkness. "Maybe you deserve better than me." The thought, once voiced, gained substance and weight. By morning, it had solidified into a plan. Rowan would take Finch to Dr. Chen, ask her to find him a proper home with people who could provide everything he needed. Warmth, stability, security. It would be the selfless choice, the right choice for Finch's future. The decision made, Rowan felt both hollowed out and strangely relieved. He would do this one last good thing for Finch, then what? Return to his solitary existence? Move on to another town? The future beyond this decision remained foggy, unexamined. He spent the day in a state of detached calm, going through their usual routines while mentally saying goodbye. At the library, he used the computer to look up the clinic's hours, planning to go first thing the next morning. At the park, he let Finch play longer than usual, memorizing the sight of the kitten rolling happily through the fallen leaves. That evening, they took shelter in the church's outdoor storage shed, a spot Earl had shown him that offered better protection from the elements than the park bandstand. As Rowan arranged their sleeping area, Finch explored the small space in his cart, occasionally returning to bump his head against Rowan's hand as if checking that he was still there. Each small gesture of trust and affection was a knife twist in Rowan's heart. He removed Finch from his cart for the night, setting him in his blanket nest while avoiding those trusting amber eyes. "It's for the best," he told himself as he settled into his sleeping bag. He'll have a real home, real family. Sleep eluded him. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shed's tin roof. Sometime after midnight, it began to rain, a cold, steady downpour that drummed against the roof like countless tiny fists. In the darkest hour before dawn, Rowan woke to a strange sound. Finch was crying, not his usual meow, but a distressed rhythmic wail that Rowan had never heard before. The kitten was dragging himself across the floor of the shed, his cart abandoned, clearly searching for something. "Finch?" Rowan called softly, sitting up. "What's wrong, buddy?" The kitten continued his labored journey across the cold floor, crying all the while. When he finally reached Rowan's sleeping bag, he pulled himself up onto it with determined front paws and began pawing at Rowan's chest, still making that heartbreaking sound. "Hey, hey," Rowan soothed, gently picking up the kitten. "I'm right here. What's gotten into you?" As he lifted Finch, Rowan noticed something caught in one of the wheels of the abandoned cart, a scrap of paper that had somehow wound itself around the axle. Curious, he reached over and carefully unwound it, recognizing it as a page torn from his own notebook, where he'd written the clinic's address and hours for the next day. The realization hit him with physical force. Somehow, Finch had sensed his intention to leave him. The thought was irrational. Finch couldn't read, couldn't possibly know what Rowan had planned, yet the timing and the kitten's obvious distress seemed too pointed to be coincidence. Cradling Finch against his chest, feeling the small body tremble with emotion or cold or both, Rowan was overcome by a wave of shame. How could he have convinced himself that abandoning this creature who trusted him so completely was the right thing to do? "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Finch. I won't leave you. I promise." The kitten's crying gradually subsided, replaced by the familiar rumble of his purr. He pressed his head under Rowan's chin, as if accepting the apology, offering forgiveness that Rowan wasn't sure he deserved. For the first time since finding Finch, Rowan allowed himself to weep. Not silent tears quickly brushed away, but deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from some long-buried place within him. He cried for all he had lost, for the man he had once been, for the future he couldn't see. And through it all, Finch remained pressed against him, a small warm anchor in the storm. When the tears finally subsided, Rowan felt emptied out, but somehow lighter, as if something poisonous had been purged from his system. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first grey light of dawn was visible through the shed's small window. "We're in this together," Rowan told Finch, his voice hoarse but steady. "Whatever happens, we stay together. That's the deal." Finch's purr intensified, vibrating against Rowan's heart like a second-hand promise. Later that morning, instead of going to the clinic as planned, Rowan walked to the community center on Oak Street. The intake coordinator, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Patterson, looked up from her desk as Rowan entered, Finch in his customary place in the backpack. "I'd like to sign up for the winter shelter program," Rowan said without preamble. "For both of us." "Ms." Patterson studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We've been expecting you," she said, pulling a folder from her desk drawer. "Maribel Drayton called a week ago to say you might be coming by." As Ms. Patterson explained the program rules and expectations, Rowan felt a strange sense of déjà vu. How many intake interviews had he sat through over the years? Yet this one was different. This time, he wasn't alone. This time, he was making a choice not just for himself, but for the small being who had chosen him. "The program requires participation," Ms. Patterson was saying. "Job training, counseling sessions, community service hours. Are you willing to commit to that?" Rowan looked down at Finch, who had poked his head out of the backpack and was observing the proceedings with keen interest. 6 weeks ago, he would have walked away from such requirements, preferring the freedom of the streets to the constraints of programs and expectations. Now, he found himself nodding. "Yes," he said, "we're committed." The word hung in the air between them. Committed. Not just to a program or to temporary shelter, but to the idea that there might be a future worth working toward. A future that included both himself and the small brave creature who had, against all odds, found him in that alley and refused to let go. As they left the community center with their intake paperwork completed and a bed reserved for the following night, Rowan felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the tentative stirring of hope. Not the desperate hope of the truly destitute, but something more grounded and realistic, the hope that comes from making a choice and seeing a path forward, however difficult it might be. It wasn't a miracle or a sudden reversal of fortune. It was simply a decision to stay, to try, to believe that he and Finch deserved better than mere survival. And for that moment, walking through the cold November sunshine with Finch purring against his back, it seemed like enough. The community center's winter shelter program was housed in a converted gymnasium on the building's lower level. Rows of cots lined the walls, each with a small footlocker for personal belongings. Privacy was minimal. Curtains on metal frames could be pulled around each bed during sleeping hours, but the space was clean, warm, and secure. Rowan and Finch were assigned a cot in the corner, slightly separated from the others. Miss Koufour. Patterson had made special arrangements for Finch, explaining to the other residents that the cat was part of Rowan's rehabilitation program. It wasn't entirely untrue. Finch had indeed become central to Rowan's slow journey back from the brink. The first night was the hardest. After years of sleeping rough, the sounds of the shelter, snoring, coughing, midnight bathroom trips, kept Rowan on edge. Finch, however, adapted immediately, curling up on the foot of the cot as if he'd always belonged there, his purr a soothing counterpoint to the unfamiliar noises. By morning, Rowan was exhausted but resolute. The shelter program's daily schedule was posted on the wall: breakfast at 7, job training at 9, community service in the afternoon, group counseling after dinner. The structure was both comforting and intimidating, a framework around which to rebuild a life if he could manage to fit himself into it. "Quite the schedule they've got you on," remarked a voice beside him as he studied the board. Rowan turned to find a woman in her 60s observing him with keen interest. She wore a practical cardigan over a floral blouse, her silver hair cut in a neat bob. Despite the early hour, she looked completely put together, as if she'd stepped out of a different world than the shelter's stark reality. "I'm Eleanor Hodges," she continued, extending a hand. "Volunteer coordinator. You must be Rowan, and this must be the famous Finch I've been hearing about." Rowan shook her hand, surprised by the firm grip. "Famous?" Eleanor smiled. "Word travels. A homeless man and his paralyzed kitten on wheels. That's the kind of story people remember. Maribel's been singing your praises at the church council meetings." Uncomfortable with the attention, Rowan changed the subject. "I'm supposed to report for community service this afternoon. Do you know where I go for that?" "You're looking at her," Eleanor replied. "I assign the service placements based on skills and interests. What did you do before?" She trailed off diplomatically. "Construction," Rowan supplied. 15 years with Hadley Brothers, before the recession hit and they downsized. Eleanor's eyes lit up. "Perfect. We've been trying to convert the old storage room upstairs into a children's reading nook, but we're short on skilled labor. How are you with shelving and basic carpentry?" And so Rowan's new routine began. Mornings were spent in job training classes, where he relearned how to create resumes and navigate online applications, skills that had become foreign during his years on the streets. Afternoons found him in the former storage room, measuring and cutting, building simple bookshelves and benches while Finch supervised from his cart. The kitten proved to be an unexpected asset in breaking down barriers. Children from the after-school program would stop by to check on the progress of the reading nook, but their real interest was clearly Finch. They would sit cross-legged on the floor, taking turns rolling small balls for him to chase in his cart, asking endless questions about how he had learned to use his wheels. "He must be really smart," observed one boy, watching Finch navigate around a table leg. "He is," Rowan agreed, surprising himself with the pride in his voice. "He never gives up, even when things are difficult." "Like you," the boy said matter-of-factly. "My mom says you used to live outside, but now you're building stuff again because you didn't give up either." The simple comparison, delivered without judgment or pity, left Rowan momentarily speechless. He had never thought of himself and Finch as similar in that way, both learning to adapt to circumstances beyond their control, both refusing to surrender to limitations. The most challenging part of the program proved to be the evening counseling sessions. Rowan had never been comfortable discussing his feelings, and the years of isolation had only deepened his reticence. The group counselor, a patient woman named Dr. Winters, seemed to understand his discomfort, allowing him to listen more than speak during the initial sessions. "Recovery isn't linear," she told the group during one meeting. "It's not about never stumbling. It's about learning to get back up when you do." Rowan thought of Finch, how the kitten would sometimes tip over in his cart, struggle momentarily, then right himself and continue on as if nothing had happened. Was recovery really that straightforward? Just keep going no matter how many times you fall. As November progressed toward Thanksgiving, the community center began preparations for the holiday. Children from the after-school program created paper turkeys and hand-traced leaves of gratitude to decorate the dining hall. Volunteers organized donations of food and warm clothing. The atmosphere grew festive despite, or perhaps because of, the circumstances that had brought everyone together. Eleanor approached Rowan one afternoon as he was finishing the last of the bookshelves for the reading nook. "The children have a special request," she said, a mysterious smile playing at her lips. "They want to know if you and Finch will join them for the Thanksgiving celebration." Rowan hesitated. Hammer paused mid-swing. Large gatherings still made him uncomfortable. The weight of others' gazes too heavy to bear for long. "It would mean a lot to them," Eleanor added, "especially Sophie. She's been telling everyone how you saved Finch from the trash and gave him wheels so he could run like other cats." The mention of Sophie, who had visited several times since Rowan and Finch had moved into the shelter, tipped the balance. How could he refuse when she had been so instrumental in their journey? "We'll be there," Rowan agreed, returning to his hammering to hide his discomfort. Eleanor squeezed his shoulder briefly. Wonderful. The children are planning something special for Finch. I'm not supposed to tell you what it is, but let's just say it involves a very small pilgrim hat. Despite himself, Rowan smiled at the image. He'll hate that. Probably, Eleanor laughed, but he'll tolerate it because he loves the attention. She wasn't wrong. Over the past weeks, Finch had revealed himself to be something of a performer, seeming to understand instinctively when he was being watched, and often choosing those moments to demonstrate his most impressive maneuvers in his cart. The children adored him for it, and he basked in their admiration with feline satisfaction. The day before Thanksgiving, as Rowan was applying the final coat of paint to the reading nook bookshelves, Maribel Drayton appeared in the doorway. "It looks wonderful in here," she said, admiring his handiwork. "You've transformed the space." Rowan straightened, brushing paint from his hands. "It's coming along," he acknowledged, uncomfortable with praise but learning to accept it. "The kids helped choose the colors." Maribel nodded, then held up a large paper bag. "I've brought something for Thanksgiving. For both of you." Inside the bag, Rowan found a new flannel shirt in deep blue, still with the tags attached, and a small cat-sized bow tie in matching fabric. "The shirt might be a bit big," Maribel said apologetically. "I had to guess your size." Rowan ran his fingers over the soft fabric, unable to remember the last time he'd owned anything new. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you. Earl and his wife are coming tomorrow too," Maribel continued. "And Dr. Chen said she'd try to stop by in the afternoon. It's becoming quite the gathering." The news that so many people from their journey wanted to be present left Rowan feeling both touched and overwhelmed. 6 weeks ago, he had been virtually invisible, a shadow moving through the town unnoticed and unremarked. Now he was at the center of a growing web of connections, each thread binding him more firmly to a community he hadn't known existed. That evening, as he prepared for bed in the shelter's communal bathroom, Rowan studied his reflection in the spotted mirror above the sink. The face that looked back at him was still weathered, still bearing the marks of years on the streets. But something had changed in the eyes. The dead, flat look that had been his mask for so long had given way to something more alive, more present. "Getting old, Hale," he muttered to his reflection, splashing water on his face. "Aren't we all?" came a voice from behind him. Rowan turned to find an elderly man at the neighboring sink, Harold Gaines, one of the shelter's long-term residents. At 78, Harold had been homeless for nearly a decade, following the death of his wife and the loss of their home to medical debt. "Some days I look in the mirror and wonder who that old man is staring back at me," Harold continued conversationally. "Inside, I'm still 35, with all my hair and my future ahead of me." Rowan nodded, understanding exactly what Harold meant. Inside, part of him was still the man he'd been before, the skilled craftsman with a home, a truck, a place in the world. "That cat of yours," Harold said, changing subjects abruptly as he dried his hands. "He reminds me of my Sadie. Not a cat. She was my wife. Had polio as a child, used leg braces her whole life, never let it slow her down for a minute. Toughest person I ever knew." "Finch is pretty determined," Rowan agreed. Harold nodded sagely. "Animals know things we don't. They don't waste time feeling sorry for themselves or worrying what others think. They just get on with living." He patted Rowan's shoulder as he moved toward the door. Smart man learns from his cat. The old man's words stayed with Rowan as he returned to his cot, where Finch was already curled up waiting for him. The kitten opened one eye as Rowan sat down, then stretched and yawned, showing tiny white teeth and a pink tongue. "Big day tomorrow," Rowan told him, gently stroking the soft fur between his ears. "Lots of people. Probably too much food." Finch responded with a purr, pushing his head into Rowan's palm. "Harold says I should learn from you," Rowan continued softly. "Says you know how to just get on with living, no matter what." He chuckled quietly. Maybe he's right. You never seem to doubt yourself, even when you're falling over or getting stuck in corners with those wheels. The kitten blinked slowly at him, the feline equivalent of a smile. "I'll try to remember that tomorrow," Rowan promised. "When there are too many people and too many conversations, and I start feeling like I want to disappear again." As if understanding, Finch crawled into Rowan's lap and settled there, his purr deepening. The simple weight of the kitten, warm and trusting against him, was more comforting than any words could have been. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold, with a pristine blue sky that promised perfect weather for the holiday. The community center was bustling from early morning, volunteers arriving with dishes and decorations, the kitchen staff preparing turkeys and all the traditional sides. Rowan and Finch kept to themselves during the morning chaos, retreating to the nearly completed reading nook where Rowan made final adjustments to the bookshelves. The new flannel shirt felt strange against his skin, too clean, too new, but he wore it anyway, touched by Maribel's thoughtfulness. By noon, the dining hall had been transformed. Long tables covered in white paper cloths filled the space, decorated with the children's artwork and small arrangements of autumn flowers and leaves. The aroma of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, and cinnamon-spiced apples pervaded the entire building, making stomachs growl in anticipation. "There you are," Sophie's voice rang out as she spotted Rowan hesitating in the doorway. She ran to him, wearing a dress instead of her usual jeans and sweater, her face alight with excitement. "So we've been waiting for you and Finch. Come see." She tugged at his hand, leading him to a table near the front of the room, where a small group had gathered. Maribel was there, along with Earl and his wife, Martha, Dr. Chen, and Sophie's mother, Jennifer. A handmade sign on the table read, "Finch's Friends." "We're all sitting together," Sophie explained, pointing to the place card she had clearly made herself, decorated with crayon drawings of cats and hearts. Rowan felt a lump form in his throat at the sight. These people, most of whom had been strangers 6 weeks ago, had created a place for him and Finch, had drawn them into the circle of their holiday celebration as if they belonged there. "There he is," Earl called, spotting them, "and looking mighty fine in that new shirt, I might add." Martha, a plump woman with kind eyes and a ready smile, came forward to greet him. "So, you're the famous Rowan," she said warmly. "Earl talks about you and Finch all the time, says you did a better job on that church roof than the last 3 contractors combined." Before Rowan could respond, the children from the after-school program swarmed around them, their attention focused entirely on Finch, who was riding in his backpack carrier. "Can we put his costume on now?" one of them asked eagerly. "Costume?" Rowan asked, raising an eyebrow at Maribel, who shrugged innocently. Sophie produced a small paper pilgrim hat with elastic straps and a tiny cape made from brown felt. "We made it specially for him," she explained, "for the Thanksgiving pageant." "Pageant?" Rowan echoed, feeling increasingly out of his depth. "It's just a small presentation the children have prepared," Jennifer explained, seeing his alarm. "They've written a story about the first Thanksgiving, and they wanted Finch to have a role." Before Rowan could protest, the children had carefully fitted the pilgrim hat on Finch's head and attached the cape around his shoulders. To his surprise, the kitten tolerated the costume with remarkable patience, seeming to understand that he was the center of attention, a position he clearly enjoyed. "He looks perfect," Sophie declared, clapping her hands in delight. The pageant, as it turned out, was a simple affair, the children taking turns reading parts of the Thanksgiving story they had written together, with Finch making a grand entrance in his cart at a crucial moment, rolling across a small stage area to represent the arrival of the Mayflower. The audience of shelter residents, volunteers, and family members applauded enthusiastically, Finch's appearance drawing the loudest cheers. Afterward, as everyone settled at the tables for the meal, Rowan found himself surrounded by conversation and laughter. Earl regaled the table with stories from his hardware store days. Martha shared recipes and insisted on sending leftovers home with everyone. Dr. Chen discussed her volunteer work at animal shelters in developing countries. Through it all, Rowan mostly listened, occasionally contributing when directly addressed, but content to observe the easy flow of friendship around him. Finch, freed from his costume but still the center of attention, moved from lap to lap, accepting treats and pets with royal dignity. When the meal was nearly finished, Eleanor Hodges stood and tapped her glass for attention. "Before we serve dessert," she announced, "we have a tradition here at the center. We go around the room and each person shares one thing they're grateful for this year. It can be something big or small, serious or silly. I'll start." She smiled, looking around the room. "I'm grateful for all of you who volunteer your time and talents to make this place a home for those who need one." The sharing continued around the room, each person offering a brief statement of gratitude. Some were profound: health regained, sobriety achieved, family reconciled. Others were simple: a favorite song, a sunny day, a good cup of coffee. As the moment approached for Rowan to speak, anxiety tightened his chest. What could he say that wouldn't sound trite or, worse, self-pitying? How could he express the complicated mix of emotions that had characterized these past weeks? When his turn came, Rowan cleared his throat, uncomfortably aware of all eyes upon him. "I'm grateful," he began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I'm grateful that he chose me. The simple statement hung in the air, its depth apparent to those who knew their story. Sophie nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. Earl reached over to pat Rowan's shoulder. Maribel's eyes shone with unshed tears. The moment passed, attention moving to the next person, but something had shifted inside Rowan. Speaking the truth aloud, acknowledging that Finch's presence in his life was a gift he hadn't sought, but now couldn't imagine living without, felt like setting down a heavy burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. Later, as the celebration wound down and people began to disperse, Dr. Chen approached Rowan with a small package. "I brought something for Finch," she said. "A better harness for his cart. This one should be more comfortable for longer periods." "Thank you," Rowan said, genuinely touched by her thoughtfulness, "for everything you've done for us." Dr. Chen smiled. "It's been my pleasure. Watching Finch thrive despite his challenges, and watching you rise to meet them, has been one of the highlights of my year." As she turned to leave, she added casually, "By the way, the clinic is looking for a maintenance person. Someone with construction experience who can handle repairs, keep the place running smoothly. It's not full-time yet, but it could be eventually. If you know anyone who might be interested." She let the offer hang in the air, her expression neutral, giving him space to consider without pressure. "I might know someone," Rowan replied carefully. "When would they need to start?" "After the new year," Dr. Chen said. "No rush, just something to think about." She left him standing there, the package in his hands, possibilities unfurling before him like a map to places he hadn't allowed himself to imagine reaching. That night, as the shelter settled into quiet and Rowan prepared for sleep, Finch curled against his side, purring contentedly. The day had been overwhelming in many ways. Too many people, too much emotion, too much evidence of how thoroughly his solitary existence had been invaded by connection. Yet instead of the familiar urge to retreat, to disappear, Rowan felt something different, a tentative peace, as if some long dislocated part of himself had finally slipped back into place. Not completely healed, not by any means, but realigned enough to function again. "Good day, huh?" he murmured to Finch, who responded with a sleepy blink. As he drifted towards sleep, Rowan's mind returned to Harold's words from the night before. "Smart man learns from his cat." Perhaps the old man was right. Perhaps the path forward was simply to be more like Finch, to accept limitations without being defined by them, to keep moving forward even when the way was difficult, to allow oneself to be seen, to belong. It wasn't a solution to everything. There would still be hard days ahead, setbacks and struggles. But for tonight, in this moment, it was enough to have been part of something larger than himself, to have sat at a table called Finch's Friends and found that he too belonged there. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing the coldest temperatures Mapleton had seen in years. Snow fell in thick, silent blankets, transforming the town into a postcard-perfect winter wonderland, beautiful to look at, treacherous to navigate. For Rowan, the weather brought a profound gratitude for the shelter's warmth and the stability of their new routine. Each morning began with Finch's care: food, exercise in his wheeled cart, a gentle cleaning of his hindquarters with soft wipes that Dr. Chen had provided. Then came Rowan's own responsibilities: job training classes, work on various projects around the community center, counseling sessions that were becoming marginally less uncomfortable as weeks passed. The reading nook he had built was now complete and had become the pride of the after-school program. Children gathered there each afternoon, sitting on the cushioned benches he had constructed, pulling books from the painted shelves. Finch was a regular visitor, rolling among them in his cart while they read aloud, sometimes pausing to stroke his fur or offer him a treat. "He likes the stories about animals best," Sophie had declared with absolute certainty, "especially cats who go on adventures." Rowan didn't contradict her. In truth, Finch did seem particularly attentive during story hour, his amber eyes following the readers with what appeared to be genuine interest. Whether it was the stories themselves or simply the soothing cadence of young voices, the kitten was never calmer than when surrounded by children and books. 2 weeks before Christmas, Ms. Patterson called Rowan into her office. The intake coordinator's expression was serious as she gestured for him to sit. "We've had a situation develop," she said without preamble. "The boiler in the main shelter area isn't keeping up with these extreme temperatures. We're moving all residents to the secondary shelter across town until repairs can be completed." Rowan nodded, already calculating what this would mean for him and Finch. "When do we need to move?" "That's the thing, Ms. Patterson said, her expression softening slightly. "The secondary shelter has a strict no-pets policy, no exceptions." The words hit Rowan like a physical blow. "I see," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I've been calling around," Ms. Patterson continued. "The Humane Society could take Finch temporarily, but they're at capacity with the cold weather bringing in so many strays. The veterinary clinic might be able to board him, but—" "No," Rowan interrupted, the word coming out more forcefully than he intended. "We stay together. That's non-negotiable." Ms. Patterson sighed, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. "I understand your attachment, Mr. Hale, but we're talking about potentially dangerous conditions if the boiler fails completely. I can't in good conscience allow anyone to remain here." Rowan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old instinct to withdraw, to solve his problems alone rather than accept help with conditions attached. "Then we'll go back to the streets," he said flatly. "We've managed before." "In this weather?" Ms. Patterson shook her head. "That's not an option I can support, especially with your progress in the program. There must be another solution." They sat in tense silence for a moment, at an impasse that neither seemed willing to bridge. Then came a knock at the office door. Maribel Drayton poked her head in, her expression apologetic. "Sorry to interrupt, but Eleanor said you needed to see me." Ms. Patterson looked relieved at the interruption. "Yes, please come in. We're discussing options for Rowan and Finch during the boiler repairs." Maribel glanced between them, quickly assessing the situation. "The secondary shelter won't take Finch," she guessed. "Exactly," Ms. Patterson confirmed, "and Mr. Hale is understandably reluctant to separate from him." Maribel sat in the chair beside Rowan, her manner calm and practical. "What about the church?" "St. Mark's has a small apartment above the office that we use for visiting clergy. It's empty until after New Year's." Rowan turned to her, surprised by the suggestion. "You'd let us stay there?" "It's not the Ritz," Maribel warned. "Just a bedroom, sitting area and bathroom. But it's warm, private, and definitely pet-friendly." She smiled. "Plus, you'd be close to the workshop if Earl needs help with any of his projects." The offer was unexpected and, frankly, perfect. Yet Rowan hesitated, the old wariness of being indebted, of accepting charity, rearing up inside him. Maribel, sensing his reluctance, added, "The church roof still has that leak in the north corner, and the basement steps need replacing before someone breaks an ankle. Consider it an exchange, your skills for temporary housing." Put that way, as a trade rather than a handout, the offer became something Rowan could accept without shame. "If the church council approves," he said cautiously. "They already have," Maribel replied. "Eleanor called me as soon as she heard about the boiler issue. The apartment is yours until the shelter reopens if you want it." Ms. Patterson looked relieved. "That solves our immediate problem," she said. "And you can continue with the program schedule. Job training, counseling, the whole works while staying there." And so, 3 days later, Rowan and Finch moved into the small apartment above St. Mark's Episcopal Church. The space was modest but comfortable. A twin bed with clean linens, a worn but serviceable armchair, a tiny kitchenette with a hot plate and mini refrigerator. The bathroom featured an old clawfoot tub that had seen better days but provided the luxury of a hot bath, something Rowan hadn't experienced in years. The transition was easier than expected. Finch adapted immediately, exploring every corner of their new domain in his cart, purring with satisfaction at the sunny windowsill that offered a perfect view of the street below. Rowan found himself appreciating the quiet privacy after months in the communal shelter, though he maintained his participation in all program activities. Work on the church repairs gave structure to his days. The basement steps were relatively straightforward, removing the rotted treads and risers, replacing them with pressure-treated lumber that would withstand future moisture. The roof leak proved more challenging, requiring careful investigation to locate the actual source of the water infiltration. Earl joined him for the roof work, the two men spending a cold but clear December morning tracing the path of the leak. "You're looking more yourself these days," Earl observed as they examined damage flashing around a chimney. "Less like you're carrying the weight of the world." Rowan continued working, uncomfortable with personal observations but not dismissing them outright as he once would have. "Having a place helps," he admitted after a moment. "It's more than that," Earl insisted, handing Rowan a hammer from his tool belt. "You've got purpose again, can see it in how you move, how you talk. That little cat did you a world of good." Before Rowan could respond, a shout from below drew their attention. Sophie stood in the church parking lot, bundled in a pink winter coat and matching hat, waving enthusiastically. "Mr. Rowan," she called, "is Finch up there with you?" "He's inside where it's warm," Rowan called back. "We'll be down in a few minutes." Sophie nodded, then added, "Mom says to tell you we're going to the Christmas tree farm on Saturday. and you and Finch should come. They have hot chocolate and hay rides." The invitation caught Rowan off guard. A family outing. Something normal people did during the holidays. His first instinct was to refuse, to retreat to the safety of solitude rather than navigate the unfamiliar territory of social interaction. Earl, sensing his hesitation, spoke quietly. "You should go. Kids that age don't invite people they don't genuinely want around. Besides, when's the last time you did something just for fun?" Fun. The concept seemed foreign, a luxury Rowan hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. Survival had been the priority for so long that the idea of doing something purely for enjoyment felt almost irresponsible. Yet as he looked down at Sophie, still waiting expectantly for his answer, Rowan found himself nodding. "We'll check with your mum about the details," he called down. Sophie's face lit up with delight. "Yay, I'll tell her." She ran off, her pink hat bobbing through the snow-covered parking lot. "Well, look at you getting a social life," Earl teased, returning to the roof repair. "Next thing you know, you'll be hosting dinner parties in that fancy apartment of yours." Rowan rolled his eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind it. In truth, the prospect of the outing, while anxiety-inducing, also stirred something long dormant. Anticipation. The simple human experience of looking forward to something. The Christmas tree farm excursion turned out to be less daunting than Rowan had feared. Jennifer, Sophie's mother, treated him with the same casual friendliness she showed everyone, including him in conversations without demanding he carry them. Sophie was delighted to introduce Finch, wearing his special winter jacket, to the farm's resident animals, goats, sheep, and an ancient donkey that regarded the wildcat with philosophical equanimity. For Rowan, the most unexpected pleasure came from watching Finch experience new things. The scent of pine trees, the texture of hay beneath his wheels, the taste of a tiny lick of whipped cream from Sophie's hot chocolate. The kitten's evident enjoyment, his openness to each new sensation, was a reminder of how to approach the world, with curiosity rather than fear. As Christmas approached, the church became a hub of activity. Choir rehearsals, pageant preparations, and charitable initiatives filled the building at all hours. Rowan found himself drawn into the periphery of these activities, not as a central participant, but as a helpful presence, fixing a wobbly shepherd's crook for the pageant, reinforcing the platform for the nativity scene, stringing lights along the pathway to the main entrance. One evening, as he worked on adjusting the sanctuary door that had begun to stick in the cold weather, Rowan became aware of music drifting up from below. The choir was rehearsing "O Holy Night," the harmonies rising through the old building like smoke through a chimney. He paused in his work, listening despite himself to the interweaving voices. How long had it been since he'd allowed himself to simply stop and listen to music, to appreciate beauty for its own sake? The realization that he couldn't remember was sobering. In the apartment that night, as Finch played with a catnip mouse Sophie had given him, Rowan found himself humming the carol under his breath. The simple act, this small surrender to something beyond mere survival, felt like crossing a threshold he hadn't known was there. The week before Christmas brought the season's worst storm, a blizzard that shut down roads and knocked out power across town. St. Mark's, with its old but reliable generator, became an impromptu warming center for those whose homes had lost heat. The church hall filled with families, elderly neighbors, and others seeking refuge from the dangerous cold. Rowan worked tirelessly alongside church volunteers, setting up cots, distributing blankets, and maintaining the generator that kept the heat flowing. Finch became an unexpected morale booster, rolling among the displaced people in his cart, accepting pets and offering silent companionship to anxious children and worried adults alike. "He knows who needs him," Maribel observed, watching as Finch settled beside an elderly woman who had been quietly weeping over the photograph of a man, presumably her late husband. The kitten pressed against her leg, his purr audible even from across the room. Slowly, the woman's hand descended to stroke his fur, her tears subsiding as she focused on the small creature beside her. "He always has," Rowan agreed, remembering how Finch had found him that first night, how the kitten had somehow known that Rowan, despite his circumstances, was someone who would stop, who would help. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping everyone inside as Christmas Eve approached. The scheduled pageant and services were in jeopardy, but Pastor Thomas, a practical man in his 60s with a gift for improvisation, proposed a solution. "We'll have our celebration right here, with everyone who's sheltering with us," he announced during a planning meeting. Not the traditional service, perhaps, but in keeping with the true spirit of the season, finding light and community in the darkest time. And so Christmas Eve found the church hall transformed. Battery-operated candles glowed on every table. The children's choir, supplemented by several young guests from the warming center, prepared to sing. The simplified pageant was ready with borrowed costumes and hastily memorized lines. Rowan observed the preparations from his usual position on the periphery, appreciating the organized chaos while maintaining a safe emotional distance. He had agreed to help with the technical aspects, making sure the generator continued to function, ensuring the temporary sound system worked properly, but had declined involvement in the actual celebration. "At least come sit with us," Maribel urged as the time for the service approached. "You've earned a break after all your work these past few days." Before Rowan could formulate an excuse, Sophie appeared at his side, tugging at his hand. "You have to come now," she insisted. "Finch is in the pageant." "What?" Rowan asked, certain he had misheard. "He's the special star," Sophie explained, pulling him toward the front of the hall where chairs had been arranged in rows. "Come see." Too confused to resist, Rowan allowed himself to be led to a seat in the front row next to Jennifer, who smiled apologetically. "The children were very insistent," she whispered. "I hope you don't mind." Before Rowan could ask exactly what he was supposed to not mind, Pastor Thomas stepped forward to begin the service. His welcome was warm and inclusive, acknowledging both regular parishioners and those who had sought shelter from the storm. "Tonight we remember that the first Christmas didn't happen in a cathedral or palace," he said, his deep voice carrying without the need for amplification. "It took place in the humblest of settings, among unlikely witnesses. So perhaps this improvised celebration, born of necessity and shared circumstance, brings us closer to that original night than any perfectly planned service could." The children's choir sang, their young voices clear and earnest. Readings from scripture alternated with carols sung by the entire assembly. Then came the pageant, a simple retelling of the nativity story, performed by children ranging from preschool to middle school age. Rowan watched with mild interest until the moment when the child narrator announced, "And a special star appeared in the sky, guiding the wise men to the place where the baby lay." At this cue, Eleanor Hodges appeared from behind a makeshift curtain, carrying Finch in his cart. The kitten had been fitted with what appeared to be a glittering star costume, a soft harness with gold and silver streamers attached, creating a starburst effect around his small body. Finch, far from being distressed by this arrangement, seemed to understand that he was the center of attention. He held his head high as Eleanor carefully placed his cart on a slightly elevated platform, positioning him above the nativity scene as the special star. The children playing the wise men approached, looking up at Finch with expressions of exaggerated wonder. The audience responded with a collective awe, several people reaching for phones to capture the moment. Rowan sat frozen, a complex mix of emotions washing over him. There was embarrassment, certainly. This public use of Finch as a pageant prop was far outside his comfort zone, but beneath that was something deeper and more surprising. A fierce pride in how Finch handled the situation, adapting to yet another unexpected circumstance with grace and apparent enjoyment. And deeper still was a realization that struck Rowan with unexpected force. Finch truly had become a star of sorts, not just in this pageant, but in the larger story of their community. The paralyzed kitten on wheels had, through his simple existence and unconquerable spirit, brought people together, created connections where none had existed before. As the pageant concluded and Finch was carefully returned to Rowan's care, people approached to compliment the kitten's performance, to stroke his fur, and tell Rowan how meaningful they found their story. Even those who had been strangers days ago, temporary refugees from the storm, seemed to have absorbed the tale of the homeless man and the abandoned kitten who had saved each other. Later, as midnight approached and the impromptu congregation sang "Silent Night" by candlelight, Rowan stood at the back of the hall with Finch in his arms. The kitten, tired from his theatrical debut, rested his head against Rowan's chest, purring softly. In that moment, surrounded by gentle voices and flickering light, Rowan experienced something he had not felt in years, a sense of belonging, not complete, not without complications, but real nonetheless. This community, this unlikely collection of people brought together by circumstance, kindness, and a small cat with indomitable will, had somehow made space for him, exactly as he was. The storm outside continued, wind howling against the old building's walls, but within, in the warmth of shared humanity and simple connection, Rowan found himself facing the winter's test, not alone, but accompanied, And that, he was beginning to understand, made all the difference. The new year arrived in Mapleton with a gentle snowfall that transformed the town into a landscape of soft edges and muffled sounds. From the window of the church apartment, Rowan watched the flakes drift past the streetlights, creating halos of gold in the early evening darkness. Finch sat beside him on the windowsill, his front paws pressed against the glass, fascinated by the falling snow. In the 2 months since they had moved into the apartment, the kitten had grown noticeably, not just in size but in confidence. His wheeled cart, adjusted several times by Earl to accommodate his growth, had become such a natural extension of his body that he maneuvered it with impressive speed and precision. "Big day tomorrow," Rowan reminded him, gently scratching behind the kitten's ears. "Dr. Chen wants to see how you're doing, and then I have that interview at the clinic." The veterinary clinic position, maintenance supervisor with potential for expansion to facilities management, had developed from Dr. Chen's casual suggestion at Thanksgiving into a formal job offer. The work would be part-time initially, just 20 hours a week, but it came with the possibility of full-time employment as the clinic expanded its operations in the spring. Rowan's feelings about the opportunity were mixed. On one hand, the prospect of regular employment, of returning to the structured world of paychecks and schedules, was deeply appealing. On the other, it represented a commitment to staying, to putting down roots in a community he had only recently allowed himself to become part of. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Maribel entered at his invitation, carrying a garment bag and a small box. "Sorry to barge in," she said, though her expression suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "I wanted to drop these off for tomorrow." She hung the garment bag on the back of the door and placed the box on the small table that served as both desk and dining area. "Nothing fancy," she assured him, seeing his questioning look. "Just a decent shirt and tie for the interview, and Eleanor sent the box. She said it's something for Finch to wear to the clinic." Rowan raised an eyebrow. "Finch doesn't need clothes for a vet appointment." Maribel laughed. "Try telling that to Eleanor and the after-school kids. They've decided he's a fashion icon since his star turn in the Christmas pageant." Despite himself, Rowan smiled at the memory. Finch's performance as the special star had become something of a legend in the week since Christmas Eve, with several people requesting copies of the photos Eleanor had taken. The kitten, for his part, seemed to enjoy his minor celebrity status, preening whenever someone recognized him during their walks around town. "How are the shelter repairs coming along?" Rowan asked, changing the subject. "Slow but steady," Maribel replied. "The new boiler's installed, but they're still working on updating the electrical system while they're at it. Ms. Patterson says probably another 2 weeks before residents can move back in." She hesitated, then added, "Though I understand you might have other options by then." The comment hung in the air, neither question nor presumption, but an acknowledgement of possibilities. Rowan nodded, not quite ready to discuss plans that still felt tentative, vulnerable to disruption. Maribel, sensing his reticence, didn't press. "Well, I'd better get going. Earl and Martha are expecting me for dinner. Good luck tomorrow, though I doubt you'll need it. Dr. Chen is already convinced you're the right person for the job." After she left, Rowan opened the garment bag to find a simple white button-down shirt and a blue tie with subtle grey stripes. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that would make him feel like he was pretending to be someone he wasn't. Maribel had chosen well. The box contained what appeared to be a tiny bow tie on an elastic band, sized perfectly for a cat, in the same blue as the human tie. A note in a child's careful handwriting read, "For Finch to match Mr. Rowan, from Sophie." Rowan shook his head, amused and touched by the thoughtfulness. "Looks like we're both getting dressed up tomorrow," he told Finch, who had abandoned his snow-watching to investigate the box. That night, as Rowan prepared for bed, he found himself taking stock of the changes the past 3 months had wrought. The man who had discovered a paralyzed kitten in a trash-soaked box behind a supermarket had been hollow, reduced to mere survival, invisible by both circumstance and choice. The man who now stood considering a job offer, who had people who knew his name and his story, who had a small creature depending on him. This man was not whole, not yet, but he was substantively different. The transformation had not been painless. There had been moments of retreat, of doubt, of the old instinct to disappear reasserting itself. The counseling sessions at the shelter program had forced him to confront truths he'd spent years avoiding, about his slide into homelessness after losing his job, about the pride that had prevented him from seeking help, about the depression that had deepened with each passing month on the streets. But alongside the difficult reckonings had come unexpected gifts: Sophie's unquestioning friendship, Earl's gruff mentorship, Maribel's practical kindness, the community's gradual acceptance, and most importantly, Finch, the small, determined creature who had somehow known that Rowan, despite all evidence to the contrary, was someone worth choosing. Morning arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. Rowan dressed carefully in the shirt and tie Maribel had brought, surprised to find they fit well. His reflection in the small bathroom mirror was that of a stranger, or perhaps of someone remembered from long ago. The beard was neater now, trimmed regularly at the shelter's monthly grooming day. The eyes were clearer, the posture straighter. Not a transformation exactly, but a reclamation. Finch, sensing the importance of the day, submitted to having the tiny bow tie fastened around his neck with minimal protest. The effect was undeniably charming. The small tabby with his spectacle-like markings now looked like a distinguished professor, particularly when he sat up straight in his cart. Very dignified, Rowan told him, unable to suppress a smile at the sight. They arrived at the clinic 10 minutes early for Finch's appointment, which was scheduled before Rowan's job interview. The waiting room was busy with mourning patients, dogs on leashes, cats in carriers, even a rabbit in a small portable enclosure. Several people recognized Finch, having seen his picture in the local paper after the Christmas pageant, and came over to greet him. Rowan still found such attention uncomfortable, but he had learned to manage it for Finch's sake. The kitten, in contrast, clearly enjoyed being recognized, holding his head high as children and adults alike admired his bow tie and his custom-painted cart. Dr. Chen greeted them warmly, ushering them into an examination room where she proceeded to give Finch a thorough checkup. "He's doing exceptionally well," she announced after weighing him and testing his reflexes. "Good weight gain, excellent muscle tone in his front legs, and his coat is beautiful, a sign of proper nutrition and care." She made some adjustments to the harness that attached Finch to his cart, explaining that as he grew, the fit would need regular modification to prevent any rubbing or discomfort. "But overall, he's thriving. You've done a remarkable job with him, Rowan." The praise, delivered matter-of-factly rather than with excessive sentiment, was easier to accept than it once would have been. "He makes it easy," Rowan replied. "Knows what he wants and goes after it." Dr. Chen smiled, a valuable quality in any species. She completed her notes in Finch's chart, then glanced at her watch. "We have about 15 minutes before your interview. Would you like some coffee while we wait?" The interview itself was less formal than Rowan had anticipated. Dr. Chen and the clinic's office manager, a no-nonsense woman named Rita, asked practical questions about his construction experience, his familiarity with various systems and repairs, and his availability. They explained that the position would involve everything from fixing leaky faucets to coordinating with contractors for larger projects, with the potential to expand into overseeing the planned addition to the clinic later in the year. "We're growing faster than expected," Rita explained. "More pets, more services, more staff, all of which means more maintenance needs. We'd rather have someone reliable on staff than continue calling different repair services each time something breaks. And of course, being pet-friendly is a job requirement," Dr. Chen added with a smile, nodding toward Finch, who had been permitted to stay for the interview and was currently exploring the office with great interest, "which you've obviously demonstrated." By the end of the conversation, it was clear that the job was Rowan's if he wanted it. The hours would be flexible, the pay fair and the environment supportive. Dr. Chen even mentioned the possibility of arranging housing. The clinic owned a small apartment above the reception area that had been used for storage, but could be converted into living quarters. "Something to consider for the future," she said. "No pressure either way." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Chen handed Rowan a business card with his start date and time written on the back. "Welcome to the team," she said simply, extending her hand. The walk back to the church apartment was cold but bright, the winter sun reflecting off the snow with dazzling intensity. Rowan carried Finch in the backpack, protecting him from the freezing sidewalks that would have been uncomfortable for his wheeled cart. They were halfway home when Rowan realized he was smiling. Not the careful, measured smile he sometimes produced for social situations, but a genuine expression of something like happiness. The sensation was so unfamiliar that it took him a moment to identify it. He had a job. He had a place to live, at least temporarily. He had people who knew his name, who would notice if he didn't show up somewhere he was expected. And he had Finch, the unlikely catalyst for all of these changes. As if sensing Rowan's thoughts, the kitten shifted in the backpack, poking his head out to observe their surroundings. His small face, with its distinctive markings, was alert and curious, taking in the winter landscape with evident interest. The bow tie was slightly askew now, giving him a rakish, adventurous look. "We did it, buddy," Rowan told him quietly. "Or I guess you did it, really. Found the one person who needed you as much as you needed them." Finch responded with a soft purr that Rowan felt through the fabric of the backpack, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something inside him, something that had been still and silent for too long. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Rowan began his job at the clinic, quickly proving his value by solving persistent issues with the heating system and rebuilding the wobbly reception desk. Finch accompanied him to work, becoming an unofficial mascot for the staff and a comfort to nervous animal patients and their owners. The shelter reopened and most residents returned, grateful for the improved facilities. Rowan, however, remained at St. Mark's, accepting the church council's offer to extend his stay in the apartment while he continued working on various maintenance projects around the building. "It's a mutually beneficial arrangement," Pastor Thomas explained. "We get your expertise, you get stable housing. No charity involved, just fair exchange." The distinction remained important to Rowan, though less rigidly so than before. He had come to understand that interdependence, the web of giving and receiving that connected people to one another, was not the threat to dignity he had once perceived it to be. There was, he was learning, no shame in being part of a community. February brought the town's annual Valentine's Day festival, a weekend of activities designed to brighten the depths of winter. The community center organized a special event, a fundraiser for its programs that would feature success stories and opportunities for support. "We'd like you and Finch to be part of it," Eleanor Hodges told Rowan one afternoon as she visited the clinic to pick up medication for her elderly cat. "Nothing elaborate, just a few minutes to share your experience with the shelter program and how things have changed for you both." Rowan's immediate instinct was to refuse. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the idea of standing before a crowd, exposing his story, made his chest tighten with anxiety. Eleanor, sensing his reluctance, added gently, "Your story gives people hope, Rowan. It reminds them that second chances are possible, that small kindnesses matter. But of course it's entirely your decision." He agreed eventually, not out of obligation but from a growing recognition that their journey, his and Finch's, might indeed offer something valuable to others, not as an inspirational tale of triumph over adversity, which felt false and simplistic, but as an honest account of how connection could begin with something as small as hearing a cry that others ignored. The day of the event arrived cold but clear, the community center decorated with paper hearts and twinkling lights. A small stage had been set up at one end of the main hall, with chairs arranged in rows facing it. By early evening, the space was filled with people, some familiar faces from the shelter and church, others strangers who had come to support the center's work. Rowan waited backstage, Finch beside him in his cart, both of them uncharacteristically nervous. The kitten's bow tie, a red one for the occasion, another gift from Sophie, was slightly crooked, and Rowan found himself adjusting it repeatedly, a displacement activity for his own anxiety. "You'll be great," Maribel assured him, stopping by to check on them before taking her seat in the audience. "Just speak from the heart. That's all anyone wants to hear." When his name was called, Rowan stepped onto the stage, Finch rolling beside him in his cart. The lights were brighter than expected, making it difficult to see individual faces in the audience. In a way, this was a relief. It created the illusion of speaking to no one and everyone simultaneously. Rowan had prepared notes, but found he didn't need them. The story emerged naturally, without embellishment or self-pity. The night behind the supermarket, the cry that stopped him, the battle within himself about taking on responsibility for another living creature when he could barely care for himself. He spoke of Finch's determination, how the kitten never seemed to view his paralysis as a limitation, but merely as a circumstance to be navigated. He described the gradually widening circle of support that had formed around them. Dr. Chen with her medical expertise, Earl with his ingenious cart design, Sophie with her unquestioning friendship, Maribel with her practical assistance. "I thought I was helping him," Rowan said, looking down at Finch, who sat attentively beside him. "But the truth is, he was saving me. Every time I wanted to give up, to disappear back into invisibility, he needed me to be present, to be seen. His dependence gave me purpose when I'd forgotten what that felt like." The hall was silent, the audience rapt. Rowan could feel their attention like a tangible thing, not judgmental, but engaged, receptive. "There's no dramatic transformation to report," he continued honestly. I didn't go from homeless to hero overnight. Recovery isn't linear, as Dr. Winters at the shelter keeps reminding us. There are still hard days, still moments when I want to retreat. But Finch doesn't allow retreat. He expects forward motion, even if it's on wheels. A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the audience at this, breaking the tension slightly. The biggest lesson I've learned, Rowan concluded, is that none of us makes it alone. Not me, not Finch, not anyone in this room. We need each other, not just for survival, but for meaning. For the reminder that we matter, that our choices impact others, that we are seen. As he finished speaking, Finch chose that moment to roll forward to the edge of the stage as if taking a bow. The audience broke into applause, many rising to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed directed as much toward the small cat as to the man who had found him. Afterward, as people mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Rowan found himself surrounded by well-wishers. Some shared their own stories of hardship and renewal. Others simply wanted to meet Finch and hear more about his adventures. There were offers of support, practical suggestions for future possibilities, and genuine expressions of gratitude for his willingness to share their journey. Through it all, Rowan felt a curious sense of calm, not the detached numbness that had been his defense mechanism for so long, but a centered presence, an ability to be fully in the moment without the overwhelming urge to escape. Later that evening, back in the church apartment, Rowan sat by the window watching the stars emerge in the clear February sky. Finch, tired from the excitement of the day, was curled up on his lap, the bow tie finally removed, his small body rising and falling with each breath. The future remained uncertain in many ways. The job at the clinic was going well, but it wasn't yet full-time. The apartment at St. Mark's was temporary, though there had been talk of extending the arrangement indefinitely. The deeper wounds that had led to his years on the streets, the depression, the isolation, the pride that prevented asking for help, were healing, but not fully healed. Yet as Rowan stroked Finch's soft fur, feeling the kitten's purr vibrate against his palm, he recognized that uncertainty was not the same as emptiness. The days ahead might not be mapped out in detail, but they contained possibilities that would have seemed impossible 4 months ago. "We've come a long way from that alley, haven't we?" he murmured to Finch, who responded by stretching and settling more comfortably on his lap. Outside, snow began to fall again, large flakes drifting past the window in the golden glow of the streetlights. Inside, in the warmth of their shared space, Rowan Hale, no longer invisible, no longer merely surviving, continued to learn from the small creature who had chosen him, how to adapt, how to persist, how to accept help, how to belong. There was no dramatic conclusion to their story, no neat resolution that erased all difficulties. There was simply this: a man and a cat, both damaged in different ways, both learning to navigate the world on their own terms, a community that had expanded to include them, a future that, while uncertain, contained more light than darkness. And perhaps that was the most important lesson Finch had taught him, that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not grand or momentous, but small and persistent. The courage to keep moving forward, one day at a time. The courage to be seen, to connect, to try again. The courage to believe that a cry in the darkness might be answered, that an outstretched hand might be met, that what seems like an ending might actually be a beginning. As Finch slept on his lap, trusting and content, Rowan gazed out at the falling snow and allowed himself to feel something he had forgotten how to recognize. Not happiness exactly, but its quieter cousin, hope. Hope that didn't deny reality or promise miraculous transformations, but that whispered of possibilities, of continuing journeys, of stories still unfolding. It was enough. For tonight, for this moment, it was more than enough.